Before you decide what this story is, you need to understand who is speaking to you. I am not repeating a rumor or retelling a legend. What happened to me happened in New York City in the winter of 1935, while the city was still awake and people like me were supposed to disappear into the background without anyone noticing. I worked nights. I moved through alleys, stations, and service corridors after midnight when the city relaxed and stopped paying attention. That was when it found me. It did not rush. It did not hesitate. It stood upright, stepped out of the darkness like it belonged there, and crossed the distance between us faster than anything human should be able to move. I survived because it led me. I am certain of that. And I am certain that I was not the only one it attacked. If you are listening to this, do not treat it like entertainment. Stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel and keep these stories alive, because what hunted night workers in 1935 did not vanish. It learned how to hide. And now I will tell you how it chose me. I had already been working the night routes for almost 4 years by the winter of 1935, long enough to know that New York after midnight was not the same city people bragged about during the day. Because once the offices emptied and the elevated trains thinned out, the streets stopped pretending they cared who you were or whether you made it home. My job kept me moving between supply points along the west side, carrying sealed crates and handwritten manifests that no one wanted delivered during daylight hours. And I learned quickly that survival at night depended less on strength and more on attention, because the city always announced danger if you listened carefully enough. That night the air felt heavier than usual, not cold enough to sting, but dense in a way that pressed against my lungs. And I remember noticing how quiet certain blocks had become even though the clocks said it was still early, because the sounds that normally stitched the city together were missing, leaving footsteps and distant machinery, isolated instead of blended into noise. I turned down a service alley I had used dozens of times before, one that cut between 2 warehouse buildings with broken windows and rusted fire escapes, and I felt that familiar tightening in my stomach that told me I was being watched. Even though there was nothing visible behind me when I checked. I kept walking because stopping in the city was often more dangerous than moving, and I reminded myself that fear came easily at night when exhaustion set in. But that logic did not hold when the sound of movement behind me changed, becoming heavier and more deliberate, as if whatever followed was no longer bothering to mask its presence. I told myself it was another worker or a stray dog or even my own imagination. Yet every step I took was answered by something that did not match human rhythm and did not scrape like paws on stone either. When I reached the midpoint of the alley, the sound stopped entirely, and the silence that replaced it felt unnatural, as if the city itself had paused to listen. And that was when I sensed it standing behind me, rather than approaching, close enough that the air felt disturbed. I turned slowly because some instinct told me running would be a mistake. And what I saw locked my body in place before my mind could fully understand it. It stood upright in the narrow spill of light from a street lamp at the far end of the alley, taller than any man I had ever seen, with shoulders set wide and arms hanging longer than they should have. And although its outline was unmistakably canine, there was nothing animal in the way it held itself. Its head was angled slightly downward, not in a snarl or display of rage, but in a manner that suggested focus. And its eyes reflected light without glowing, dark and intent, fixed entirely on me. I did not hear it breathe, and I did not hear it growl, yet the pressure in my chest intensified as if my body understood something my mind still refused to accept, and before I could step back or shout or do anything at all, it moved. The distance between us collapsed in an instant, not with a leap but with a smooth and terrifying speed, and the impact knocked me off my feet, as if I had been struck by a speeding vehicle rather than a living thing. I remember the weight of it pinning me to the ground, the strength in its grip as it held my shoulders, and the unmistakable sensation of intelligence behind its eyes as it studied me. And in that moment I was certain that whatever this was had attacked before and would attack again. When it released me, it did so deliberately, stepping back and retreating into shadow without sound, leaving me gasping on the pavement with broken breath, and the knowledge that I had been spared rather than missed. I do not know how long I lay there after it disappeared, but when I finally forced myself to move, every part of my body shook with pain and shock, and the alley that had felt narrow before now seemed endless. as if the walls had shifted closer while I was on the ground. I staggered back toward the streetlight, checking my limbs and ribs for damage, and although I could barely stand upright, I was alive, which felt less like relief and more like a question that had no answer. When I reached the street, the city resumed its noise as if nothing had happened, and the normal sounds of engines and distant voices felt wrong, almost insulting, because they suggested continuity where there should have been rupture. I tried to flag down a passing patrol car, and when the officers finally stopped, they looked at me with the tired impatience reserved for drunks and liars. Even as I struggled to explain what had attacked me and where it had happened, they examined the alley with flashlights and notebooks, but they did not search it the way men do when they believe a threat remains, and their questions shifted quickly from concern to suspicion, focusing on whether I had been drinking or fighting or imagining things under stress. One of them pointed out the marks on my shoulders and said they could have come from a mugging, and another suggested I had fallen badly and panicked afterward, and I realized then that whatever had attacked me existed outside the boundaries of what they were willing to document. I went home just before dawn with my clothes torn and my body aching, and I did not sleep because every time I closed my eyes I saw it standing under that light, not as a blur or a shadow, but with clear intention and presence. When I returned to work days later, I learned quietly that I was not the only one who had been hurt, because another night worker had failed to show up for his shift, and then another, and then another, and the stories began to circulate in whispers that stopped when supervisors walked by. One man claimed he had seen something upright crossing the tracks ahead of his train, moving against the flow of light as if it understood timing, while another swore he heard footsteps following him that suddenly became too heavy and too fast to be human. None of us spoke openly, because we all understood the unspoken rule that night workers were replaceable and complaints were liabilities. Yet the pattern grew harder to ignore as injuries appeared that did not match known weapons or attacks. Bodies were found later with crushed chests and broken necks, positioned as if they had been carried rather than dragged, and although newspapers used cautious language and police dismissed connections, the men who worked after midnight knew better. We began altering routes and traveling in pairs when possible, but even that did not stop it entirely, because whatever hunted us understood the city better than we did and knew when isolation was unavoidable. I realized then that my survival had not been accidental, because it had allowed me to walk away and speak, and in doing so it ensured that doubt would fracture any truth I tried to share. What attacked us in 1935 was not a creature lost in the city, but something that had learned how to move through it unseen, and as the attacks continued, I understood with growing certainty that it was not finished. After the second body was found, the men on my route stopped pretending that what was happening could be explained by the usual city violence, because there was a difference between a man being robbed and a man being handled like he weighed nothing, and we all felt that difference in our bones, even if we could not prove it on paper. The foreman called it bad luck and told us to keep our heads down, and the police told us to avoid alleys and travel in groups, but both of those instructions felt like a cruel joke, because the work itself required isolation, and the city at night was built from narrow passages and blind corners where a person could disappear in a single step. I began carrying a heavy wrench in my coat pocket, not because I believed it would stop anything that could move the way I had seen, but because holding something solid gave my hands a purpose beyond shaking. I also began writing details down, because memory alone changes when fear touches it, and I refused to let my own mind make excuses for what I knew I had seen. So I kept a small notebook with times, locations, and names, and I marked every incident that sounded even remotely similar to mine. The list grew faster than it should have, and it became clear that the attacks were not random, because certain neighborhoods and certain routes produced stories again and again, as if something was mapping the city according to its own logic. One night, about a week after my attack, I was assigned to deliver a crate to a maintenance office near the edge of the rail yards, and I asked another man, a thin older worker named Arthur Haynes, to walk with me. Even though it was not customary, Arthur did not argue, because by then everyone understood that pride was an expensive habit, and we moved together through a stretch of streets that were quiet but not deserted, with the usual late diners, the occasional taxi, and the faint glow of a diner sign that made the block feel less threatening than it truly was. When we turned toward the access road that led behind the warehouses, the air changed again, and I felt the same pressure in my chest that I had felt in the alley, not as panic, but as a physical certainty that something had entered the space with us. Arthur stopped and listened, and his face tightened in a way that told me he felt it too. And when he whispered my name, I understood that he was about to say he wanted to turn back, but the choice was taken from us before the words left his mouth. A sound came from the far end of the access road, not a growl and not a bark, but a low exhale that seemed to carry weight, and then something moved across the road under the nearest street lamp. It did not sprint like a dog, and it did not stumble like a man, because it moved upright with a smoothness that made my stomach turn, and even from that distance I recognized the proportions, the long arms, and the way the head remained steady as the body advanced. Arthur backed toward me, and I tried to pull him closer to the wall, because instinct told me to make ourselves smaller, but the creature did not hesitate, and the streetlight seemed to shrink around it as it approached. Arthur raised his hands and shouted, and the sound broke the night like glass, and for a fraction of a second the creature paused, not from fear but from assessment, and that pause felt worse than an attack because it suggested calculation. Then it moved again, and the distance between us vanished in a way that made the human world feel slow and fragile, and before I could swing the wrench or even turn fully, it slammed into Arthur with enough force to knock him sideways into the wall. I heard ribs crack, and Arthur made a sound that was not a scream but something emptied out of him. And the creature's arms wrapped him with a grip that looked almost careful, as if it knew exactly how much pressure was required to disable without tearing. I swung the wrench at its shoulder and felt metal strike something hard beneath fur, and the creature turned its head toward me with that same dark, reflective stare. And in that instant, I understood that it could have ended me there if it wanted. Instead, it released Arthur, stepped toward me, and held my gaze for a long, unbearable moment, as if it wanted to ensure I would remember it clearly. Then it moved away, not running, not panicking, but slipping back into darkness as if the shadows were a doorway it could use at will. And it left us on the road with Arthur coughing blood and me shaking so badly I could not lift my arms again. When the police arrived, they wrote it up as an assault by unknown persons, and when I insisted it was the Dogman, they stared at me with the same tired contempt they reserved for lunatics. Arthur survived the night, but his eyes never recovered, because after that he stared at corners as if he expected the darkness to step forward and speak. Arthur was taken to a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and hopelessness, and I visited him once, not out of friendship alone, but because I needed to know whether he remembered what he had seen or whether my mind had begun to fracture under stress. He did remember, and he remembered too much, because he described the creature's posture and its hands with a precision that matched my own memory, and he kept repeating the same detail that chilled me more than anything else, which was that it had looked at him like a person looks at a tool, not with anger, but with a cold evaluation of use. After Arthur's attack, the night workers did what the police would not, because we started sharing information quietly, passing notes in break rooms and whispering in stairwells, and we began to see patterns that were impossible to dismiss. The Dogman did not strike in crowds, and it did not strike where there was a clear line of sight, but it struck near choke points, near tunnels, near service entrances, and near routes that required a man to walk between two lit zones through a stretch of darkness. It was as if it understood the exact moments when a person would assume they were still safe, even while stepping into the only seconds where no one would witness anything clearly. We also learned that it seemed to avoid certain areas without explanation, and that made it worse, because avoidance implied preference, and preference implied a mind that understood territory. A man named Salvatore, who worked deliveries out of a waterfront warehouse, told us he had seen it on a rooftop line once, upright and still, watching traffic below as if studying it. And another man claimed he heard heavy footsteps above him in a service corridor, even though there was no second level on the building plan. Those reports sounded impossible, but the city itself was built on impossibilities, and the deeper we looked, the more we realized that there were spaces beneath New York that were not on any map we had access to. Old maintenance shafts, abandoned spur tunnels, and sealed stairwells that had been closed for years and forgotten. I began to suspect that the Dogman was not simply hiding in the city, but using it, because every time an attack happened, it was followed by a stretch of days where it seemed to vanish, and then it would reappear in a different district, as if it had traveled unseen. The thought that it could move through New York without ever using the streets the way we did made me feel trapped inside a machine I did not understand. because the city had always been my environment, my advantage, and my protection, and now it felt like a structure that belonged to something else. One night near the end of that month, I followed a rumor that a worker had gone missing near a sealed service entrance by a station that had been under repair, and I went there not because I believed I could save anyone, but because I needed confirmation that what we were facing was connected to the underground. The entrance was a metal door half concealed behind stacked crates, and the lock had been broken in a way that looked intentional rather than forced, as if someone had opened it carefully and then left it to appear closed. I shone my flashlight into the gap and saw dust and old concrete steps descending, and the air that drifted up was cold and stale, carrying the faint smell of iron and damp stone. I should have walked away immediately, but fear can become a kind of gravity, and I stepped down 2 stairs, then 3, then 4, and each step made the street noise above fade until the city sounded distant and unreal. Somewhere below me, deeper in the stairwell, I heard a slow scrape, then a pause, and then a sound like a breath being released through teeth, controlled and patient. I backed up, and I made myself climb slowly because I refused to give it the satisfaction of panic. But the moment my head rose above street level, I felt it, the sense of presence behind me, and I knew with absolute certainty that it was close enough to touch. I turned, and in the thin line of light between the door and the frame, I saw a hand, not a paw, not a human hand, but something shaped for grasping, with long fingers ending in dark nails, resting against the metal as if it had been waiting there quietly for me to look. Then the hand withdrew, and the door moved slightly inward, not slamming, not shaking, but opening with calm control, and the darkness inside seemed to swell forward. I ran, not because I believed I could outrun it, but because every part of me screamed that the next moment would decide whether I lived or disappeared. And as I fled into the streetlights, I heard footsteps behind me that were steady, upright, and impossibly close, as if it was letting me go again on purpose. After that night at the service entrance, I stopped telling myself that the Dogman was only a predator, because predators kill and move on, while whatever this was seemed to shape the city around the attacks, as if it wanted the fear to travel farther than the bodies. I also stopped pretending that the police would ever chase it properly, because to chase something you must first admit it exists. And New York in 1935 did not reward men who admitted to monsters, especially when those men wore work boots and carried crates for a living. I began to move through the city as if I were being tracked at all times, and I learned that constant vigilance has a cost, because it makes every shadow feel guilty and every sound feel like a warning, and you start to lose the ability to tell ordinary danger from extraordinary danger. Even so, I kept working, partly because I needed the wages, and partly because I could not accept that the creature had the right to push me out of my own routes. So I forced myself to return to the hours where it hunted, and I tried to build a plan out of small, practical rules that might keep me alive. I stayed in lit corridors whenever I could. I avoided dead-end alleys. I timed my crossings to coincide with passing traffic, and I never walked under scaffolding or fire escapes where movement could be hidden above me. But even those rules failed once I noticed how often the creature seemed to place itself just beyond the edges of light. There were nights when I would see nothing at all and still feel it near, and there were nights when I would catch a shape between buildings that vanished too cleanly to be a man. And I began to understand that the Dogman's greatest advantage was not speed or strength, but patience, because it could wait as long as it needed to wait, and waiting made every precaution feel temporary. The city itself started to show signs that something had changed, and I do not mean in newspaper headlines or official statements, because those remained cautious and dismissive, but in the behavior of night workers who had no language for what they were avoiding. Men began to take longer routes without explanation, and some stopped working nights entirely, and those who remained grew quiet in a way that felt like collective shame, as if admitting fear would make it real. I heard the same phrase repeated in different mouths, spoken quickly, and then buried under a change of subject, which was that the Dogman attacked when you were almost safe, when you were 1 block from a lit doorway, when you could already smell food or hear voices, because it knew that was when you would relax. One evening, I was approached by a man who introduced himself as Edwin Markham, who said he worked as a reporter for a small paper that covered labor issues and municipal failures, and he asked me whether I had been attacked because he had heard accounts that sounded too similar to ignore. I did not trust him at first because reporters can turn suffering into entertainment, and I refused to be a spectacle, yet Edwin spoke with a seriousness that did not feel hungry for attention. And he offered something the police never had, which was willingness to write down exactly what I said without laughing. We met in a diner near the rail yards, where the coffee tasted burned and the booths were cracked from years of restless bodies. And I told him everything, including the detail that the creature had looked at me like a chosen object rather than prey. Edwin listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he did not ask whether I was drunk or confused, but asked whether I would be willing to show him the locations, because he believed the pattern mattered, and he wanted to see whether the underground entrances were connected. 2 nights later, Edwin met me again, dressed plainly and carrying a small camera and a notebook, and we walked toward the service entrance, where I had seen the hand. I did not like bringing him there, because I had the strong sense that the Dogman noticed when attention moved toward its spaces. But Edwin insisted that if the creature was real, then documenting its territory was the only way to force the city to acknowledge it. As we approached the door, the air turned cold and still, and Edwin's confidence thinned into caution, and I realized that the sensation I felt was not only fear, but recognition, because the presence was already there, listening. Edwin raised his camera and stepped closer to the door, and the metal surface reflected a thin line of streetlight like a blade. Then, from inside, a sound came that was not a growl and not a scrape, but a low, controlled movement, as if something had shifted its weight in preparation. Edwin froze, and I reached for his arm, and in that moment the door moved inward just an inch, opening without force, opening like an invitation, and the darkness behind it seemed deeper than the stairwell should allow. Edwin whispered that he could take a photograph, and I told him to back away because it wanted him closer, but before we could move, the streetlight above us flickered once, then again, and I felt the pressure in my chest turn into certainty. The Dogman was not merely nearby, because it was choosing whether to come out, and the choice would not depend on chance. Edwin did not back away fast enough, and I do not blame him entirely, because a man who believes he can capture truth with ink and film often forgets that some truths capture you instead. He lifted his camera again and angled it toward the opening, and when the light from the street lamp flickered for the 3rd time, the darkness inside the doorway shifted, and I saw a silhouette rise as if it had been crouched on the stairs and had decided to stand fully upright. The Dogman stepped into the thin spill of light with a calm that made my skin tighten, because predators that fear you show tension, while predators that understand you show control, and this creature showed nothing but control. Its shoulders cleared the doorway without effort, its arms hung long and heavy at its sides, and its head remained steady, angled slightly downward, as if it was looking at Edwin's heart rather than his face. Edwin's breath caught, and I heard him whisper a prayer in a voice that sounded far away, and I knew that he had crossed from curiosity into the kind of fear that changes a man permanently. The creature did not rush, and it did not roar, yet Edwin stumbled backward anyway, because the mind cannot tolerate the sight of something that breaks its rules. I pulled him toward the street, and for a brief instant I believed we might reach the corner where traffic moved, because cars were passing and voices were present, and I thought noise might discourage it. That belief lasted only until the Dogman moved, because when it moved it erased the distance, as if distance had been a lie, and it reached Edwin before my hands could fully close around his coat. It struck him from the side with a force that spun him onto the pavement, and the camera clattered away, and in the harsh light his face looked shocked rather than wounded, as if his body had not yet received the message that it was breaking. The Dogman lifted him by the front of his coat, and Edwin's feet dragged along the ground, and the way the creature held him was not wild, because its grip was precise, placed high on the chest and neck in a way that prevented Edwin from shouting properly, reducing his voice to a strangled sound that did not travel. I grabbed the camera without thinking, and the metal felt cold in my hands, and I raised it as if it were a weapon, because desperation will make you hold anything like a gun. I shouted at the creature, and the sound came out stronger than I expected, and for a second the Dogman's head turned toward me, and I saw the eyes clearly, dark and reflective, and I felt that same awful recognition I had felt in the alley, because it looked at me not as an enemy, but as a witness it had already decided to spare. Then it shook Edwin once, not violently, but with a controlled motion that produced a sharp crack, and Edwin went limp in a way that told me his spine had failed. And I stood there unable to move because part of my mind refused to accept what my eyes had just seen. The creature lowered Edwin's body to the ground as if placing an object down, and that act of calm handling was worse than brutality because it suggested purpose beyond killing, and I realized it was not feeding because it was performing. A car horn sounded from the corner, and headlights swept across the street, and in that moment I expected the creature to retreat, but it did something else instead. It stepped closer to the light, letting its shape be seen more clearly, letting the outline register for anyone who looked, and I understood that it wanted the city to see just enough to doubt itself. The driver slowed, and I saw his face turn toward us, and then his eyes widened, and his car swerved as if he had seen an accident, not a monster, because the mind chooses ordinary explanations even when the extraordinary stands in front of it. The Dogman turned back to Edwin's body, then looked at me again, and I felt a message in that stare that did not require words, because it was telling me that I would carry the story whether I wanted to or not. Then it stepped backward into the doorway, and the darkness swallowed it instantly, and the door moved slightly as if a hand had guided it, not shutting fully, but resting half open, as if it expected someone else to follow. I dropped to my knees beside Edwin and put my fingers against his throat, and I already knew what I would find, yet I checked anyway, because denial demands ritual. The streetlight above us steadied again, and the city resumed its noise. And I heard footsteps approaching from the corner, and I understood that when the police arrived, the report would not say Dogman, because reports never say Dogman. But I also understood something worse, which was that the creature had just proven it could kill in the open and still vanish. And if it could do that once, then it could do it again. After Edwin was pronounced dead, the city behaved exactly as I knew it would, because the official story was assembled before the body was even cold, and every detail that did not fit into a familiar category was quietly trimmed away. The report said he had been attacked by unknown assailants, possibly during a robbery attempt, and the broken camera was listed as damaged personal property rather than evidence. No mention was made of the doorway, the timing of the lights, or the way his body had been handled, and when I tried to correct those omissions, I was told firmly and without anger that my account was inconsistent and emotionally compromised. I was questioned for hours in a small room that smelled of tobacco and old paper, and although the men across the table never raised their voices, their patience felt rehearsed, as if they had practiced listening without believing. They asked me the same questions repeatedly, changing the phrasing slightly each time, and when my answers remained consistent, I could see disappointment flicker across their faces, because consistency did not help them close the file. Eventually, one of them leaned back and told me that New York had enough problems without imaginary creatures, and that if I wanted to keep my job and my freedom, I would be wise to let the matter rest. Word spread quickly among night workers that Edwin was dead, and it spread even faster that I had been with him, and the looks I received afterward were different from before, because fear had turned into something sharper. Some men avoided me entirely, as if proximity might attract the thing that followed me, while others pulled me aside and spoke in hurried whispers, asking whether it was true that the creature stood upright, whether it had hands, whether it watched before it struck. I answered honestly when I could, and when I could not, I said nothing, because speculation felt dangerous in a city that already refused to acknowledge truth. What troubled me most was not the disbelief, but the sense that the Dogman had adjusted its behavior after Edwin's death, because attacks became less frequent but more severe, and the intervals between them grew longer, as if it were measuring the city's response. When bodies were found, they were farther from each other, spread across districts that did not share obvious connections, and yet the details matched closely enough to confirm a single source. The city treated these incidents as unrelated, but those of us who moved at night could feel the pattern tightening, like a net being tested for weaknesses. I began to suspect that the Dogman was learning from us, not in a general way, but specifically from our reactions, because it struck when attention was low and withdrew when scrutiny increased, and that kind of adjustment required observation. The idea that it might be watching police behavior, traffic patterns, and even news cycles made me realize how exposed we truly were, because we assumed that intelligence required language and organization, and we were wrong on both counts. One night, as I walked a shortened route near the river, I noticed a series of markings on a brick wall that stopped me cold, because they were not scratches or graffiti, but impressions, deep and evenly spaced, placed at a height that no human could reach comfortably. They looked like the result of repeated contact, as if something had leaned there often, pressing weight into the surface over time. When I traced them with my fingers, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind, because the marks suggested routine rather than accident, and routine implied residence. From that point on, I stopped thinking of the Dogman as a transient threat and began thinking of it as a permanent feature of the city, something that had always existed beneath our notice and had simply chosen this period to assert itself. The thought that it might remain long after the headlines faded filled me with a quiet dread that did not spike or recede, but settled into my bones. I realized then that survival was no longer about avoiding a single encounter, but about enduring the knowledge that something shared our city and did not intend to leave. The realization that the Dogman might be permanent changed the way I moved through New York, because fear of a passing danger can be managed, while fear of an embedded one reshapes your sense of place entirely. Streets that had once felt neutral now felt claimed, and certain intersections carried a weight that made my chest tighten before my mind could catch up. I began to recognize locations not by their names but by how exposed they made me feel, and I understood that the creature's greatest victory was not the bodies it left behind, but the way it altered our relationship with the city itself. I decided then that waiting was no longer an option, because passivity only allowed the Dogman to dictate terms, and although I knew I could not confront it directly, I believed that understanding its movements might offer some measure of control. I returned to the places where attacks had occurred, not immediately after, but days later, when the city had erased visible traces and returned to routine. I looked for subtle changes, disturbed debris, displaced objects and patterns of wear that suggested repeated use, and I found more than I expected. Near a disused loading dock in the garment district, I found scuff marks high on a wall where something had braced itself repeatedly, and beneath them were fragments of concrete crushed into powder, as if compressed by weight rather than struck. In an abandoned service tunnel beneath a theater, I found footprints that did not match any known shoe, elongated and uneven, with pressure points that suggested upright movement rather than quadrupedal travel. Each discovery reinforced the same conclusion, which was that the Dogman navigated the city with intent, selecting paths that minimized exposure while maximizing access. As I followed these clues, I noticed that many of them converged toward older sections of the city, areas built over previous foundations that had been modified repeatedly without full demolition. These zones were riddled with forgotten spaces, half-sealed rooms, and passages that connected to nothing on current maps, and I realized that the Dogman did not need to cross streets or enter buildings openly, because it could move beneath them, emerging only when necessary. The city's layered history had created a network of shadows that it exploited with ease. One evening, while examining a sealed stairwell near an old transit spur, I felt that familiar pressure again, and I froze, because the sensation no longer felt sudden but anticipatory, as if something had noticed my investigation and was deciding how to respond. I turned slowly, expecting to see movement, but instead I saw absence, a section of darkness that seemed deeper than the surrounding shadows, as if light avoided it. The realization that the Dogman might be present without revealing any physical form unsettled me more than any previous encounter. I backed away carefully, keeping my eyes on that darkened space, and I became aware of a low sound that vibrated rather than traveled. Something felt more than heard. It was not a growl or a breath, but a resonance, and it seemed to emanate from the structure itself, as if the building were carrying the creature's presence. The sound stopped abruptly, and the pressure lifted, and I knew I had been warned rather than attacked. From that moment on, I understood that my investigations were not going unnoticed, and that the Dogman was capable of restraint when it suited its purposes. That knowledge was both a relief and a terror, because it suggested that my survival still depended on its choices rather than my own. I returned home that night with the uneasy certainty that the creature was no longer merely reacting to the city, but actively shaping how far I would be allowed to go. And as I locked my door and listened to the ordinary sounds of the building settling around me, I wondered whether the Dogman considered me a threat, a witness, or something else entirely, because whatever role it had assigned me, I sensed that the final decision had not yet been made. The weeks that followed felt suspended outside ordinary time, because although days continued to pass and the city resumed its routines, I lived with the constant sense that a line had been drawn and that I was standing on the wrong side of it. Sleep became fragmented and unreliable, not because I dreamed of the Dogman in obvious ways, but because my body refused to fully rest, as if it understood that awareness was the only thing keeping me alive. I began waking at precise moments in the night, with no sound to explain it, and each time I lay still and listened, waiting to hear footsteps that never quite came close enough to confirm themselves. It was during this period that the attacks resumed with a renewed clarity of purpose, because when the Dogman struck again, it did so in a way that left no ambiguity about intent. A watchman was found beneath an elevated track with injuries consistent with crushing force rather than blades or clubs, and a delivery driver vanished entirely between two checkpoints less than 3 blocks apart, leaving behind only a broken lantern and deep impressions in the dirt that suggested he had been lifted rather than dragged. These incidents reignited fear among night workers, but they were treated publicly as unrelated events, each folded neatly into a different explanation that required no further investigation. I attended Edwin's funeral quietly, standing at the edge of the gathering and watching how quickly a life could be reduced to polite condolences and lowered voices, and I realized then how easily truth disappears when it threatens stability. His editor spoke of dedication and integrity, and no one mentioned why Edwin had been walking near abandoned service entrances at night, because asking that question would have required answers no one wanted to hear. As the service ended and people dispersed, I felt a familiar pressure in my chest, and I could not shake the sensation that I was being observed even there, surrounded by daylight and witnesses. Shortly after that, I was visited at my apartment by a man who did not identify himself clearly, but who spoke with the careful neutrality of someone representing authority without wanting to leave a trace. He suggested that my continued discussion of the Dogman was unhealthy and potentially dangerous, not only for me but for public morale, and he advised me to consider leaving the city for a while. The implication was clear even if it was never stated directly, because my survival had shifted from being a matter of chance to being a matter of convenience, and convenience can change quickly. That night, I made a decision that frightened me more than the creature itself, because I chose to return deliberately to the areas where it hunted, not to investigate further, but to confirm something I had begun to suspect. I walked the perimeter of several known attack sites and noted how often I felt that presence rise and fall, and I realized that the Dogman did not react to me with immediate aggression anymore, because it allowed me to move through its territory unchallenged. That allowance felt like a message, because predators do not ignore prey unless the relationship has changed. As I stood beneath an elevated track listening to the distant rumble of trains, I understood that the Dogman had recognized me as something other than a target, and that recognition carried responsibility whether I wanted it or not. I was no longer simply surviving encounters, because I had become part of the pattern, and patterns do not release their components easily. The certainty that it was aware of my awareness closed around me like a trap, and I knew that the city I thought I understood had revealed a deeper structure that did not answer to human rules. The final encounter did not happen the way I expected, because there was no chase and no sudden violence, and that absence made it more terrifying than any previous attack. It occurred on a narrow street near the river just before dawn, when the city exists in a fragile balance between night and day, and people assume safety has returned simply because the sky begins to lighten. I felt the presence before I saw anything, and instead of running, I stopped, because instinct told me that flight would only confirm the role I was trying to escape. The Dogman emerged slowly from between two buildings, fully upright and completely exposed, and for the first time I saw it clearly without the interference of shadow or artificial light. Its size was imposing but controlled, and its movements were deliberate rather than aggressive, and as it approached, I realized that this was not a confrontation but a demonstration. It stopped several feet away and held my gaze, and in that moment the city around us felt distant and irrelevant, as if we were occupying a separate layer of reality that existed beneath the one everyone else accepted. I understood then that it could have killed me at any time, and that the restraint it showed was not mercy, but intention, because it wanted something from me that did not require words. The message was simple and devastating in its clarity, which was that the city belonged to those who knew how to move through its hidden spaces, and that humans survived, there only by agreement. The Dogman was not leaving, and it was not hiding, because it had never needed to do either. After a long moment, it stepped backward into shadow and vanished without sound, leaving me standing alone in a street that looked ordinary again the instant it was gone. I waited for fear to overwhelm me, but instead I felt a strange resignation, because understanding can dull panic even when it brings no comfort. I knew then that my role was not to stop what was happening, but to remember it accurately, because memory was the only form of resistance available to someone like me. I left New York shortly after that encounter, not because I believed distance would make me safer, but because staying would have meant accepting the rules of a city that no longer belonged to its people alone. I carried the story with me, knowing that telling it would invite ridicule and disbelief, but also knowing that silence would make me complicit in the lie that nothing hunted there. The Dogman did not follow me, but I have never believed that meant it forgot me, because predators do not forget witnesses, and cities do not forget what lives beneath them. And if you are listening to this now, then understand that this story was never meant to be comforting, because it exists to remind you that even the most crowded places can hide things that do not fear exposure, only acknowledgement. I did not return to New York for many years, and when I finally did, it was not out of nostalgia or courage, but because distance had failed to quiet what the city had planted in me. I told myself that time changes places, and that whatever lived there in 1935 would have moved on or been buried beneath new concrete and steel. Yet the moment I stepped back onto the street, I felt the same subtle pressure settle into my chest, not sharp and immediate, but familiar, like a memory that recognizes its owner before the owner recognizes it. The city looked different on the surface because buildings had been replaced and routes had shifted, but the deeper structure felt unchanged. And I realized that New York does not erase its past so much as it layers it, stacking new lives over old ones without sealing the seams. As I walked through neighborhoods that had once been part of my routes, I noticed how easily people ignored the spaces between places, the alleys, the service doors, the stairwells that led nowhere obvious. And I understood again how something could move through the city without being seen simply by inhabiting what no one wanted to acknowledge. I did not see the Dogman during that visit, and that absence was more unsettling than any encounter because it suggested choice rather than limitation. I passed locations where attacks had occurred and felt nothing more than a faint awareness, as if I were being observed from a distance too great to confirm, and I wondered whether the creature recognized that I no longer belonged to the pattern it had shaped years earlier. The thought that it might still remember me without needing to reveal itself reminded me that survival does not end an encounter. It only postpones its meaning. As I prepared to leave the city again, I stood near the river at dusk and watched the lights come on one by one, and I thought about the men who never left, whose names were reduced to brief notices and quiet funerals, and whose stories were absorbed by the city without resistance. I realized then that the Dogman did not need to be seen often to remain real, because its true presence existed in the behavior it shaped, in the way people hurried past certain corners, avoided certain stairwells, and trusted that danger belonged somewhere else. I am telling this story now not because I believe it will change anything, but because silence is the only thing that allows creatures like that to thrive completely. If you work at night, if you move through the city when most people are asleep, then you already understand how thin the boundary between safety and disappearance can be. Remember that predators do not always hunt loudly, and that intelligence does not require language to be effective. If you choose to dismiss this as a story, then you will be doing exactly what the city did in 1935, and the city survived that choice only by allowing others to pay the cost. But if you listen carefully and carry the memory forward, then at least one part of what happened will remain human, because acknowledgement is the one thing that does not belong to the shadows. This is where my account ends, not because the danger ended, but because my part in it did. And if you are still listening, then you are now part of what keeps the truth from disappearing entirely. If you listened all the way to the end, then you already understand something most people never do, which is that the darkest stories do not come from imagination, but from the places where history chose silence over truth. What happened in New York in 1935 was not recorded because the city decided it was easier to forget than to confront what hunted its night workers. And forgetting is the most effective camouflage any predator can have. If this story disturbed you, then it did its job. And if it made you think twice about the way cities hide their secrets, then you are exactly the kind of listener this channel is for. These are not campfire stories. These are stories that were buried, dismissed, and left unfinished. And they only survive because people like you choose to listen instead of looking away. Now I want you to do two things. First, subscribe to this channel and stay with these stories because every time one is ignored, another disappears with it. Second, leave a comment and tell me what story you want to hear next. Tell me the place. Tell me the year. Tell me whether you want another Dogman case or something else that was never supposed to be documented. The more specific you are, the deeper we will go. Because the truth is not gone. It is just waiting for someone to ask the right question.